The last day of death row. Inmate Robert Fratta. A father's deadly betrayal. Hello, friends. Tonight we travel to Texas for a case that stunned both the courtroom and the community. Robert Fratta, once a respected public safety officer and firefighter, became infamous not for his service, but for plotting the death of his own wife, behind closed doors. Their marriage was filled with turmoil, bitter arguments, accusations of cruelty, and a looming divorce that threatened to take away his children and his pride. In November 1994, Farah Baker returned home from a simple evening out, unaware that a gunman was waiting in the shadows of her garage. What followed was a crime so calculated and cold that investigators immediately suspected the man who had sworn to protect her. Nearly 3 decades later, Texas set his execution date for January 10th, 2023. Join me tonight as we walk through his final 24 hours. And don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories that stay with you. Robert Allen Fratta was born on Long Island, New York, in 1957. Like many young men of his generation, he dreamed of building a stable life, and by the early 1980s, he had moved to Texas to pursue new opportunities. He worked for American Airlines, where his path crossed with a young woman named Farah Baker. Farah was just 21, bright, adventurous, and recently relocated with her family from England. They began dating soon after meeting at the airport, and married not long after. On the surface, their life looked ideal. They had 3 children: Bradley, Daniel, and Amber, and settled in the city of Humble, Texas. Robert eventually left the airline industry and joined Missouri City Public Safety, serving as both a public safety officer and firefighter. To neighbors and friends, they seemed like a family with everything in place. But behind closed doors, the reality was much darker. The marriage between Robert and Farah was rocky from the start. Friends recalled heated arguments, Robert's controlling nature, and Farah's constant attempts to hold the family together. By 1992, she could no longer bear the situation. She filed for divorce, citing cruelty and abuse. In her filings, she described behavior that shocked even seasoned attorneys. Robert had strange demands, a bad temper, and a lifestyle filled with infidelity and strip clubs. Farah wanted out, and she wanted custody of the children. The divorce proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years. During this time, Robert grew increasingly angry. He complained to his friends, especially his gym buddies, that he was broke from paying child support. He told them he wanted custody so that Farah would have to pay him instead. Some of his comments went far beyond frustration. He openly talked about hiring someone to kill his wife. At least 7 men from the gym later testified that Robert had mentioned his desire to find a hitman. Some dismissed it as venting. Others thought he was joking, but no one reported it to authorities. Tragically, that silence would soon cost Farah her life. On the evening of November 9, 1994, Farah took her children to dinner with Robert at a cafeteria. Afterward, Robert drove the children to church for a class, while Farah went to get her hair done. During the church service, Robert's oldest son, Bradley, noticed his father was constantly on the phone. Phone records later showed those calls were to a cell phone belonging to Mary Gipp, the girlfriend of one of Robert's gym acquaintances, Joseph Pricetash. Joseph Pricetash was Robert's link to violence. That night, Pricetash met with 18-year-old Howard Guidry, a neighbor who agreed to carry out the actual shooting. The plan was simple. Robert would signal when Farah was returning home. Pricetash would provide the gun, and Guidry would wait in the garage. At around 8 o'clock in the evening, Farah pulled into her garage, as she always did. She stepped out of her car, opened the side door, and came face to face with Guidry. He raised the gun and fired once into her head. Farah fell, but was still alive. Guidry turned back, fired again, and left her lifeless on the floor beside her car. Neighbors heard the shots and immediately called 911. They described seeing a man running to a waiting car and speeding off. Farah was rushed to the hospital, but pronounced dead shortly afterward. Detectives wasted no time focusing on Robert. They knew of the bitter divorce and the upcoming custody battle. Farah herself had told friends and even detectives that she feared Robert would try to harm her. After the attack, Robert was brought in for questioning. But despite hours of interrogation, there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. He walked free, appearing calm, even smug, as cameras recorded his every move outside the police station. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed on. The key came from Mary Gipp, Pristash's girlfriend. At first, she stayed silent, but when threatened with prosecution herself, she made a deal with the district attorney in exchange for immunity. She revealed everything: Robert's role in setting up the murder, Pristash's role as the middleman, and Guidry's role as the shooter. She even handed over a piece of paper where she had written the serial number of the murder weapon. Police traced the gun back to its registered owner, Robert Fratta, with confessions from both Guidry and Pristash, phone records linking Robert to the killers, and the weapon tied directly to him. The case came together. Within months, all three men were arrested and charged with capital murder. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Robert as a cold and calculating man who wanted his wife dead simply to avoid paying child support. They showed how he had talked about killing Farah for months, how he provided the gun, and how he coordinated the timing from a church phone just as his children sat nearby. His lack of emotion after Farah's death only added to the picture of a man without remorse. Robert was convicted and sentenced to death in 1996. Pristash and Guidry also received death sentences in separate trials, but the case didn't end there. In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Robert's conviction, ruling that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated because his defense had not been able to cross-examine the co-defendants whose confessions were used against him. For a brief moment, it seemed Robert might escape the ultimate punishment. Yet 2 years later, in 2009, he was retried. This time, prosecutors relied on testimony from gym acquaintances, phone records, and physical evidence. Even without the original confessions, the case was overwhelming. Robert was again found guilty and sentenced to death. For nearly 3 decades, Robert maintained his innocence. "I had nothing to do with my wife's death," he repeated again and again. But his children wanted nothing to do with him. Raised by their grandparents, they changed their last name from Fratta to Baker, honoring their mother's family. They refused contact with Robert, calling him Bob instead of father. On Farah's gravestone, the name engraved was her maiden name, Baker, a final separation from the man who had arranged her death. As January 10, 2023 approached, Robert's final day arrived. He was transferred to the holding cell near the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas. Guards reported that he was calm, almost detached. Unlike other inmates who requested elaborate last meals, Robert made no unusual requests. His time was spent quietly, with the awareness that the end was near. That evening, witnesses filed into the observation room: reporters, officials, and members of Farah's family. They had waited nearly 30 years for this moment. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Robert was led into the chamber, strapped to the gurney, and asked if he had any last words. True to form, he said nothing. No apology, no statement, only silence. At 7:49 in the evening, the drugs began to flow. Within minutes, Robert's chest stopped rising. At 7:55 in the evening, he was pronounced dead. Dear friends, his silence in the death chamber was as telling as his actions years earlier. He left this world without remorse, without apology, and without a word of comfort for the family he destroyed. Yet for Farah's loved ones, the memory of her laughter and kindness still stands stronger than the cruelty of the man who tried to erase her. Justice delayed was finally justice delivered, but the scars remain. Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories that reveal the final hours on death row.